Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Karen Morell of Higher Heights Consulting. I'm a consultant working with Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, and today I'm also serving as your moderator. On behalf of Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group and our partners, Ascend at the Aspen Institute and Migration Policy Institute, I welcome you to today's webinar, Working with Immigrant Families Regardless of Legal Status. Today's webinar is the second in a four-part series that will unpack the nuts and bolts of the creative strategies that nonprofit organizations are using to deliver 2-gen services to immigrants, youth, and their families. This webinar is one of a four-part series, and the first one was held last month. We surveyed the field earlier this year to identify the areas where practitioners are uncovering promising practices for working with immigrants' families using a 2-gen approach. And the webinar series was really built around those promising practices. The first webinar was on building trust, and it was held last month. We had speakers from Catholic Charities in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Denver Public Schools, and Hispanic Unity in Tampa, Florida. Our speakers shared insights about creative ways to build trust with immigrant families. So if you missed that webinar, you can catch it by watching it on the Aspen Institute, Aspen Institute CSG website. Today, we're going to talk about some of the effective practices for working with families with mixed legal status. We're going to hear from programs that have promising models and good results, in spite of the challenges that come with working with families of mixed status. We hope you're going to get some useful ideas and good information that you can incorporate into your work. We also have 2 additional webinars planned. On October 14th, we're going to focus on different approaches to grow language skills. And on November 10th, we're going to discuss cultural competence and those secrets to success. If you haven't registered for these upcoming webinars, my colleagues are going to drop the registration link in the chat. So I hope you will register and hope you will see that. Following each webinar in this series, we hold peer advising and learning sessions for each topic area. So on Thursday, September 30th, we're going to hold a peer advising and learning session about working with immigrant families regardless of legal status. So if you want to dig even deeper into today's topic, I encourage you to register for this session and to submit a question related to a challenge that you might be having regarding working with families of mixed status. We're going to pick 2 or 3 questions, and if your question is selected, you're going to receive practical, real-time advice from the speakers who are participating in today's webinar. So just a hint, when you submit your question, please make sure it's an actual question, not just a description of your situation. It's kind of like the Jeopardy game show. It actually has to be in the form of a question. And to get the best advice, be sure to make your question as specific as possible. The peer advising process is dynamic, it's fun, and it generates lots of really good ideas that you can use. However, the deadline for you to submit your question is coming up quickly. The deadline is Monday, September 20th. So my colleagues are going to drop a link in the chat. So if you want to register for this peer advising session, or if you want to submit a question, please do use that link to register and share your question. So to save time, I'm not going to do an extensive introduction of our speakers, but I do encourage you to read their bios. The bios, speaker bios, and resources that we mention on today's webinar are going to be posted on the Aspen CSG website, along with the video of today's event. So everyone who's registered, you'll receive a link to this recording and the resources. We also want to encourage a broader dialogue about these issues. So feel free to share any insights, any thoughts about this event on Twitter and LinkedIn using the tags on this slide. Just a reminder about 2 features that you can use to share your thoughts and insights with the folks who are on this webinar. First is the chat box. We're all familiar with the chat box, hopefully by now on Zoom. Please use the chat box to share your insights, or maybe to underline a point that you heard from a speaker on the chat box. Just we ask that you be mindful to use civility and compassion when sharing those comments. But if you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box. That's the box that we're going to be dedicating specifically for our speaker questions. And we're going to have some time at the end that we're going to devote for Q&A. So please do feel to drop in your questions at any time for our speakers. So before I get started, we want to share just a little bit of context about today's topic and about 2Gen. So let me start with the topic and discuss a little bit about why we're focusing on working with immigrant families regardless of legal status. So the topic emerged as one of the top strategies that programs are addressing through the survey that I mentioned earlier. But we know that there are unique challenges to providing services to families with mixed legal status. Mixed status families are not uncommon in the US. In fact, more than 14 million individuals live in a mixed status family. So that's a family in which one or more of the parents is not a citizen and one or more of the children is a citizen. Mixed status families can be made up of any combination of legal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and naturalized citizens. So there is kind of no one size fits all to this issue. But probably most importantly, legal status impacts access to major public programs, benefits, and services. And given the recent increase in anti-immigrant sentiment, even families who are legal, they often worry about applying for those benefits and services, even if they qualify. Due to that anti-immigrant status. So there are some real challenges, but we've got a great lineup of speakers that's going to share some promising practices. So I'd like to share just a bit about 2Gen, since I mentioned that this webinar series is really focused on lifting up effective practices for working with immigrant families that are using a 2Gen approach. So let me just explain what we mean when we say 2Gen approach. And I want to share a few slides that were developed by our partners at Ascend, which is also a program at the Aspen Institute. So 2Gen focuses on building family well-being by intentionally and simultaneously providing services to both adults and children. So it's working with both the adults and the children together. And when you think about a lot of the work that maybe organizations are doing and even some policies, they may have a focus just on the adult or maybe a focus on just the child. But with 2Gen, we're really working to integrate the elements that recognize the strengths of the whole family. So there's some core components of 2Gen. And so we want to show you a slide that depicts the core components. And we kind of like to think of these components as the cogs in the 2Gen machine. I want to lift up one that might be new to you. If some of you have seen this slide before, you might notice that we've added a sixth component that's K through 12. And we added that component because we know that just because a child transitions to elementary school, that doesn't preclude the family from still needing and utilizing a variety of services for the whole family. So that's kind of the newest addition to this slide. Other components for 2Gen include early care and education. And you see the slide lists a variety of platforms that are included. Head Start, Early Head Start, Child Care Partnership, Home Visiting, Family Friends, and Neighbor Care, a variety of early care settings. We also have post-secondary and employment pathways. So that would include education, training programs, workforce partnerships. And we also have economic assets, which is so important for families. You know, in order to move up the economic ladder, having access to economic assets is really, really key. We also have health and well-being as a component. It really addresses and provides resources to help mitigate toxic stress. We also want to make sure that our families have access to health services and adequate healthcare coverage. And then lastly, I'll lift up social capital. And social capital is the component that we have come to talk about as kind of the secret success to 2Gen. It really builds on research that shows that being part of a cohort or being in community and having trusted relationships, that really helps us to thrive. And it's particularly important when we're thinking about immigrant families because there's a lot of organic social capital that's been developed in immigrant communities, and that's a huge strength. All right, so now I'm going to move into the lineup of speakers. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you today. As I mentioned, I'm not going to do in-depth introductions, but I do want you to see who you're going to hear from on this webinar. And we'll hear from Vicky Rampala, who's Vice President of the Family Hub from Chicago Commons. So I'll invite, as I mention each name, for our speakers to turn on their cameras. We have Susanna Garcia. She's the Neighborhood Initiative Program Director from On the Move in Napa Valley, California. And we also have Susanna's funder partner, Julia DiNatale, who's the Vice President of Community Impact from the Napa Valley Community Foundation. And I'm also pleased to introduce Margie McHugh. She's one of our partners for this event. Margie is Director of the National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy at Migration Policy Institute. On a personal note, I'll just share that Margie and I worked together many, many years ago to help immigrants in New York to become US citizens. So it was a real treat to be able to reconnect with her on this project. Okay, so I'm going to invite Julia, Susanna, and Vicky to join me in a discussion. Okay. So I'd like to really have a conversation about some of the effective strategies that you're using to work with immigrant families, regardless of their legal status. And let's start by having each of you just share a bit of context about your work and your community. And so maybe Julia, if you and Susanna can start and just share a little bit about Napa Valley, a little bit about your community and your work.
Great. And Susanna, pick up where I leave off. Napa County is a semi-rural county in the Bay Area in California. It's about 800 square feet, but it encompasses a pretty broad variety of cities that neighbor some larger Bay Area counties, as well as some really remote rural areas. Napa County has experienced pretty dramatic and rapid change in its demography, largely as a result of immigration and the economy that drives that immigration. So in 1990, there were 93,000 Anglo residents and 13,000 Latinx residents. And today, as of the recent census, there are 90,000 Anglo residents and 48,000 Latinx residents. Napa County does not have a diverse economy. All our proverbial eggs are in the agriculture and hospitality basket. We are very reliant on immigrant labor, and 30% of our labor force earns $21 or less per hour. We're also the least affordable small metro market for housing in the country. Median home prices have risen 102% since 2013, from $417,000 to $840,000. And rents in the same time period have increased from $2,000 to $3,000 per month. Meanwhile, median income has risen only 6%. More than 50% of people working in Napa County commute from other less expensive neighboring counties. In Napa County, Latinx community members, many of whom are immigrants, represent 2/3 of our renters. And our poverty, as measured by the flawed federal poverty level, is officially about 8%, but as measured by the Public Policy Institute of California, which takes the cost of housing into account, we are generally in the high teens, have been as high as 23% poverty, which was second only to Los Angeles County.
Thank you, Julia. The only other thing I would add is that currently, right now, just based off the most recent census, there is a low education. Majority have high school or less. And currently, what we're seeing with our families is that you can find 2 to 3 families living per household. So just to give you an idea of how that relates to our immigration families as well.
Great. So Vicki, let's turn to you and hear a little bit about your work in Chicago. Tell us a little bit about your community.
Perfect. Differently than Napa, Chicago is a large urban area. Our primary immigrant populations tend to come from Spanish-speaking countries, Chinese, China in general, and Polish are the 3 major languages that have come to Chicago in the last several decades, I think. And I think the focus of what we do in my work has been in primarily the west and near south side of the city, where we have high Latinx and high African American communities in all of those areas.
Great. That was helpful to have a little bit of a backdrop about your communities and the work that you're doing. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your work, and I'm particularly curious about the pandemic and what impact that might have made on your work. So maybe, Vicki, I'll come back to you to start us on this conversation. I remember you stating how you had to think out of the box when COVID hit. So share a little bit about some of the creative things that you've done working with immigrant families and particularly those with mixed status families.
So interestingly, so my organization is focused on early childhood and seniors, but I think in the communities, we are certainly whole family focused and have intergenerational housing situations, particularly in immigrant communities, quite like Susanna described in our housing situations too. And so I think part of what we discovered in our work is that certainly early childhood is supporting of the child's growth and trajectory. But I think part of it is recognizing that the whole family may need assistance, that in our understanding of COVID positivity rates, that I think a big part of it was being able to better understand what are the whole needs of the family and not just the person who is dropping off the child, but also to look at what resources may exist in our communities to best support and create mutual aid around sort of those areas that are most needed. I think a lot of our funders during that time collectively supported an emergency relief fund that really was, regardless of one's status, that really said basic needs are central to our obligation to the citizens in Chicago. And so whether you're positive for COVID, whether your legal status is a citizen, we are going to offer and support food and rental assistance and housing assistance in a way that could help you get by. I do remember during that time that just the preponderance of folks who had positivity rates within sort of essential services and even direct service capacities in like warehouses that were these mega spreader events was really eye-opening around sort of the lack of connection to primary care and medical care in the immigrant community who may or may not have had access to healthcare, and that there was a greater vulnerability that was disproportionately affecting certainly those in the Black and Brown communities, but really a lot of the immigrant communities who may or may not even know what resources existed that they could access for medical care, which led to obviously difficulties with recovering and healing after positivity rates, but also where the access to credible information from a primary care was less involved, particularly for folks who didn't have a primary care for someone in the family, which certainly played a role in the spreading inside families in those 2-generation, 3-generational homes, but also in communities where the access and the need for work was much more predominant than it was a propensity to stay home and take care of themselves and to sort of acknowledge illness in general.
Thanks, Vicki. I heard some both challenges, many challenges, but also some opportunities with funders, kind of being more open with how the funding was used. So that was really helpful. Susanna, let's go to you, because you also mentioned specific challenges that emerged during COVID. What would you share?
Yeah, I think, especially for our immigrants in our community, similar to you, Vicki, they're a much higher risk of COVID, especially in jobs of high concentration and where physical distancing was difficult. We found many of our vulnerable workers, which are seasonal workers, being impacted. And for us, especially providing the relief programs, we had to get really creative. And, this is not the first time in Napa where we faced a disaster, along with the wildfires and previous, power shutdowns and whatnot. We found that really we have to be inclusive and accessible to everyone, regardless of immigration status. So for us to be able to build that trust with community and for them to know they can come back and rely on us for support is huge. I think wherever it's possible, creating and designing that almost that automatic enrollment for eligible individuals that you already have working with you to lower those barriers of entry, and where it's possible. And where it's not possible, having application processes where they're as simple as possible, accepting, a broad range of documents that even undocumented individuals are able to provide. So for us, it was really about eliminating all the barriers and thinking out of the box about how do we connect with these individuals, and now in a virtual way, because of course, not being able to see each other in person, where before they could come easily and walk into our doors. I think helping them even to think about connecting with us over the phone and utilizing texting and utilizing tools that we know still protect the confidentiality of the case, and have our case managers be able to work one-on-one with these clients. That was very crucial, Karen.
Great. So I'm hearing this ability to very quickly pivot your service delivery to a virtual model. Another theme I heard from both Susanna and Vicki is just this idea of eliminating barriers. And Julia, I noticed that you were nodding when Vicki was talking about the fact that funders provided support regardless of status. So I'm wondering, you have the funder perspective. What can you share about your experience during COVID and your role as a funder to support immigrant families and maybe even families of mixed legal status?
Yeah, we really saw it as our role to educate other funders wherever possible to firstly invest in organizations that already work with immigrant families and are trusted by immigrant families, and to understand that the bulk of financial assistance needs to be dedicated to undocumented families who have no recourse to other government subsidies that became available during the pandemic. We did this with our local jurisdictions as well. Whenever we had an opportunity to advocate around where funding from some of the federal sources was going, whenever allowable, we advocated that financial assistance would be dedicated to mixed status families or undocumented immigrants. You both mentioned the overcrowded housing. We saw a significant issue of families who were under isolation and quarantine orders who had 1, 2, 3 outbreaks in their home, were unable to work, were mandated by public health to quarantine and would not do so because they couldn't miss out on work and not collect a paycheck. And so we set up a program in partnership with Susanna's agency to provide pretty substantial financial assistance to these families and to educate other funders wherever possible to direct funding there. We worked together with our county government to do the same thing with farm worker housing, because of course, when disasters hit, the first economy to shut down is the economy where all of our immigrant families work. And I think that's pretty common across the country, but it's particularly dramatic in Napa County where that's our entire industry. And so we had some great success actually working with some other funders that had monies available to support families and helping them to direct them to those who were in the most need.
Great. That was, again, helpful for us to hear how you all have pivoted during COVID. But what I'd like to do now is really focus not just on what you've done during COVID, but thinking about effective practices in general. I mean, the whole purpose of this webinar is to kind of share what's working. And I want to now delve into kind of specific things that you've done to work with families of mixed status. And when we talk, I really want us to think and you all to share not just what you've done. We want to hear what you've done, but I also think it's really important to talk about how you did it. I suspect that we've got folks on this webinar that might want to replicate some of the things that you're talking about. So please don't hold back on any of the sharing of the details about how you did what you're doing. But maybe let me start with Vicki on as the first question, and at least where I want to start, Vicki. I know you've done a number of things that have been creative to work with families of immigrant mixed status, but let's talk about some of the things that you've done to generate revenue regardless of status, because you've done some creative things. So what can you share with our audience about what you did and how you did it?
Sure. So I think, the challenge, and this would be regardless of COVID, is that many folks who are undocumented are limited in their W-2 capacity for growth potential in our employment fields. And so I think a part of it is thinking, what are ways that we can help family stability in mixed status situations, particularly when the primary breadwinner is not in a cash economy and really needs some additional supports around family economic stability, particularly when that source of income closes down like COVID, and really thinking outside of the box with our families about where are the areas that they want to grow, but also what are the possibilities. And so we created an entrepreneurship series in partnership with banks, with other personal sole proprietors, to really help families understand that it could be as simple as your kids grow out of clothes and you could post their clothes on Facebook and bring in some revenue from sources, to really saying, if a hobby is cooking and you really enjoy cooking, where are spaces in your community that people would buy food that you make and still be able to create some revenue from it, and giving opportunities for that to happen. One of the ways we've done that is that we have a partnership with a farmer's market where we have a table where our parents can sell some of their wares. So they don't have to go full out, I want to create an LLC, but really I want to try out selling things that I make as a way of creating revenue generation, but really creating opportunities through virtual workshops of seeing other people doing this work and seeing how they could exercise some of their ideas into revenue generating situations in general, but also, in our relationships with banks in the last year and doing financial education and really helping families understand banking prospects for them, to really help families understand that banks are really supportive of economic growth regardless of your status, and that there are opportunities to even grow businesses with a TIN number in an LLC and even some larger capacities, that banks really want to do support within a community partnership model. And so we have several banks that really joined us in that process of really helping our parents think about what are the growth potential that they have for an idea they have into something a little bit bigger that has sort of the guardrails that helps them be protected around regulations and compliance, but also really helps them think that they are not stuck in a cash economy or stuck in one sort of lane in thinking about revenue generating ideas, but also helping families say, what are the skills and talents that you have available? And is there a market available to do that? Just like we talk to kids about, people will buy mowing of the lawn from the kid next door. There are also household related handyman possibilities that are veritable revenue generating, to help folks think sort of broader in terms of the capacity within families, but also within their skills and experience that they have available to really create other possibilities for themselves in creating some family economic stability.
So I'm going to come to Julia next, but I do want to ask you a quick follow-up, Vicki, because there was a comment in the chat about the misinformation with banks. And
Yes.
often it's hard to get people to trust banks. So again, I'm kind of digging into that. How did you do it? Tell us just a little bit about how you helped build trust with banks.
So, we are distrustful too. In some ways, I'm super protective of the communities that we're in partnership with, because I never want to violate their trust, and my organization doesn't either. So there is a vetting process that I think we did with our partners to say, what is it that you do? We want to see examples. We want to talk to people you worked with in the past, so that we have a better understanding of sort of how they work, and then making decisions about sort of who we want to intersect with our families in a way that really gets at that. Like, we have had some banking relationships that have been less engaging of the audience and didn't have bilingual staff on hand. And then some banks that really are bound inside the institution to do community engagement. Yes, I think bankers are often misinformed too about that, but these were institutions that had that community engagement part of it. And we really exercised that to interview them and to see how they could support us with our ideas, but also how they would work with our families, whether in a workshop for our families or potentially do in one-on-one product development. and helping other folks within their own institution sort of get a better idea of the possibilities to better educate the community. And so I don't know if all banks have community outreach elements, but the banks in Chicago do have a community engagement and outreach as part of their charge. And so that those are the people that we look to really support us in those understanding what those products are, but also even to educate their internal audiences around those possibilities when we sent people there.
Great. Thanks, Vicki.
Sure.
So next, Vicki, you're next on my screen, so I'm going to come to you. And I'm really curious, again, you've got that funder perspective, and it was impressive to learn about the role that you all played in uncovering and addressing the needs of the immigrant community. So I want to add as well the work that you played to channel resources to those most in need, and that includes undocumented individuals. So can you share just a little bit about what you did and how you did it?
Yeah, so our starting point was back in 2010. The conversation about the role of immigrants in our community and the contributions of immigrants in our community was completely non-existent or unproductive or polarizing like it was nationally. And we knew that whatever we did in this community, whatever impact we made, that we wanted to make an impact on the immigrant community, but we felt like we needed to start with some data so that we could have civil conversations and fruitful conversations. And so you'll hear from Margie in a little bit, but shout out to Migration Policy Institute. We worked with them, we raised some funds, and we commissioned a study on the economic and fiscal impacts of immigrants in Napa County, which really gave us some facts and figures, helped to put some language behind the challenges and opportunities, and then gave us some ideas for where at that point we could work towards some pragmatic solutions. We were pretty confident, our board was confident that we could dive into this contentious issue and come up with places where we would be able to invest to make an impact and potentially be a role model for other local funders if we started with some facts. And so, of course, we didn't learn anything that was surprising to us, but it was really helpful to have a piece of paper that we could refer to and say, yes, immigrants are a really important part of our economy and they contribute. So we learned that immigrants, mostly from Mexico, are 23% of our population, but that they were absolutely overrepresented in the workforce. They're 33% of our workforce and 73% of our agriculture and tourism workforce. And that immigrants account for $1 billion in GDP every year locally. We also learned that immigrants had a wide earning gap, and they were earning at this time years ago roughly $30,000 less than their peer non-immigrant households, but that they paid into state and local coffers at a rate that was proportional to their share of the population. And that was, believe it or not, an important data point that got us a lot of leverage and mileage with other funders or local donors. One of the things that really stood out to us was that Napa County residents who were eligible for citizenship were naturalizing at a lower rate than the rest of the state. So we were naturalizing at 30% here versus 37% in the rest of California. And we learned that children of immigrants make up half of the kids in our schools and would augment a declining younger Anglo or native-born population, which was sort of prescient because we have since that time lost thousands of local students, and the fact that immigrants are accounting for any increase in population is really important. And so what we decided to do at that time with funds that we had available was to incubate what is now called the Citizenship Legal Services Collaborative, of which Susanna's organization is a part. And it was a model to provide low cost or free legally based immigration services. But importantly, it was a model of 3 family resource centers, including On the Move, with one legal services provider that was not working in Napa County, but was working elsewhere. And that was important because the 3 family resource centers were, like I said before, already trusted messengers. And we were not saying, here, show up to our workshop and apply for DACA or apply for naturalization. Instead, we were just giving, making available some services to clients that already trusted these organizations. And since that time, in the last 11 years, we've used that study as a lens for all areas of our work. So when we think about disaster recovery or resilience, we think about it with a lens of like what Vicki was talking about earlier. How can we help immigrants in our community build assets? We launched a program a couple of years ago in partnership with Susanna that is a construction training program for solely undocumented immigrants. And so there were all these courses out there. We had lost at that time hundreds of houses. That's now doubled to wildfire. And we had a construction shortage, and yet all of these programs that existed were only for people who had legal status. And so we used some of our disaster dollars to create a program that worked at a time where somebody could be picking grapes in the morning and going to class at night. It was all in Spanish and English. Childcare was provided, financial incentives were provided, and we really view everything we do through the lens of the immigrant community here in Napa County.
So Julia, I think your response is a good setup for Susanna, because many of the things that you mentioned, the construction training program, the effort to naturalize immigrants, the leadership collaborative, those are all things that Susanna helped with. So Susanna, again, I want to turn to you now and get you to share a little bit more of the how did you do it? Again, thinking that there are probably people listening on this webinar that want to maybe do similar things. So give us a little more detail about the nuts and bolts of how you implemented some of these strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I will add is that the intentional creation of having safe and inclusive spaces for immigrants really has strengthened the fabric of our society. I think we have to be very intentional about being able to open our doors and including mixed status households. I think for us, building trust was number one, right? If we have the trust with families as an example, we have currently multiple centers located on the school sites. So not only are we opening our doors to all the families at the schools and the surrounding neighborhoods, we're also creating that welcoming space, connecting with families. We're checking in with them in the morning during drop-off. We're checking in with them at dismissal time. We have dedicated outreach staff, and we have dedicated parents who we call promotoras or parent leaders, who are out there with us, encouraging their peers to get connected to resources. Sometimes if I make the invitation, they won't come, but if their friend or their neighbor or their sister or their family member make the invitation, they'll come. So I think it's starting to create that creating those intentional spaces, building that trust, counting on leaders in the communities who are also connected to our centers. That's really what motivates people to get connected. Once folks are connected, it's ensuring that you are looking at that holistic family approach to providing that services all around to the family. Because we are centered and located on various school sites, we have that capability to provide parents that support specifically with some of your 2Gen core components that included, that K-12 supports, navigating the school system, offering an array of different types of classes that offer ESL, computers, how to volunteer in my school, how to be a room parent, and everything that would encompass leadership on a school site and in the community. So I think leveraging those partnerships with schools and their essential institutions. Every school is required to serve child regardless of immigration status. So if we can build that partnership with districts, then we can help meet families where they're at, meeting basic needs and supporting them all wrap around. One thing that Julia added with employment pathways is that, with our construction training program, these are families that we were connected with. They're families who we know are seasonal workers. Maybe we're struggling during, downtime with at their work, and we wanted them to again eliminate all barriers. So if we know that they needed childcare, we would help to provide childcare, that ongoing case management, that ongoing follow-up. At the end of the program, they were incentivized, so they couldn't leave the program ready to go and jump into work. We provided the boots, we provided the tools, we provided the employment connections, and really looked for employers that we trusted in regards to being able to connect them within, regardless of their immigration status. Not only is this, helping to build capital for fulfilling job demands, but it's also helping to build self-sufficient with our immigrant community. So
I want to build on something that you were mentioning, Susanna, and that was the importance of partnerships. You talked about the importance of the partnerships with the schools, your work with employers. We know that there's so many things that mixed family status, families of mixed status need. And so it often requires many partnerships. So I'm just going to leave this open for anyone to respond to, but I'd love to hear more about the partnerships that are really critical to reaching and supporting families of mixed status. So anyone can weigh in.
If it's okay, I'll start. So I think one of the areas that part of what we need to do is help families understand there are different avenues to do what they want to do, but also there are different possibilities on that pathway, and to know what those citizenship pathways might be. Illinois is one of the refugee asylum settlement places in the country, and so we see a high number of refugee asylum seekers, even without sort of those who come in through families in general. And so the pathways, knowing where they are, knowing those organizations and working well with them to help families understand what those cost benefit decision points are along the way, if they want to pursue those ways, and those routes to get to sort of their long-term goals for their family. But then I think it's also about saying, what are those other resources and partnerships that are critical to launching not just the parent but the whole family. We talk about true generation, and so we're talking really from my location, early childhood on, and saying, you're never too old to get a GED. We have 70-year-olds who can get GEDs too, and so really thinking about those partnerships in post-secondary adult education, but even ESL GED locations, to better understand sort of what are those places that families, as they want to progress in their own learning, but also want to progress with their own family, can gain requisite skills and knowledge, but also have partners that understand sort of what their situation could be and can help them sort of launch in that process. In our state, we actually have support for post-secondary enrollment and scholarships for DACA and undocumented families. And I think those partnerships and that financial support is really critical for helping our families move forward and grow in general, but also grow in a career development framework, sort of what Julia is talking about. We need an on-ramp for folks to be able to get there, and having partnerships of folks willing to sort of extend their reach or open up new doors and create new financial possibilities are really so essential to our families being able to do those things.
Thank you, Vicki. Yeah, I would add, partnerships are very important. In Napa, we have a very close partnership with our adult school. We work collaboratively with the Napa Valley College. And it's important, like you said, it's how do we create the stepping stone for a parent who may have, a middle school education and provide them a GED opportunity, and what's next? Maybe the adult school, now we're taking non-credit classes. So we're moving them up the ladder and providing those educational opportunities. And I think that's very important. Other partners, I think as well, you mentioned a little bit about this earlier, Vicki, but I would encourage exploring the possibility of partnering with credit unions. Currently in Napa, we have a great partnership with the Self-Help Credit Union. And one of the things that we do is we support individuals with ITINs to be able to get into that, building their assets, right? So loans for, mortgage, first-time home buyer programs, car loans, and not needing or requiring a social security number per se. So that's one way that we've been able to help with folks building assets. communities. The other thing I would say is also partnering with your local hospitals or churches. We have, one of our main programs that I mentioned earlier regarding parent education and engagement was through a partnership with St. Joseph's, Queen of the Valley Community Outreach, and we designed that program. They felt like part of having a healthy family requires, education is a big component of that, and helping to stabilize the family. So together we developed that educational program for parents. So partnerships are key. And I think you're right. Even for our case managers are doing referrals and connecting families to, different folks. I've found that when we don't have the resources or we don't have a partner who's doing that work, we have, wonderful funders who we can approach and say, identify, there's a gap, here's a need. This is what we're seeing in our communities, and still that data is very important. So, we try to find a way, but like we said, there's always going to be, there might be some gaps in communities, but that's some of the specific ways I would encourage folks to look into specific partnerships.
And I'll jump in from the funding perspective. With COVID, we have unprecedented amounts of funding coming in through government agencies, some of which will be or is currently available to undocumented immigrants. And so I think providing informal technical assistance education to our local jurisdictions, even our statewide agencies, we've had some real success with the California Department of Social Services and educating them on what the needs on the ground are, and in influencing where dollars are flowing for undocumented immigrants in our community. We also have had some success with some of the other federal funding sources that we've been able to drive towards immigrant serving agencies. One of the real key things we've seen over the last year and a half or so is some coalitions of on-the-ground nonprofits that hold all the knowledge as to what the needs of our immigrant communities are. And one role that we've taken is to financially support those collaboratives and coalitions to build some advocacy muscle so that they are the ones saying, here's where this funding needs to go. And they've been actually pretty successful at that. Also utilizing employers as best as possible. So it could be with our construction training program, finding and working with employers that will hire people who may not have, a legal W-2, or funders who are willing to give access to certain services to their employees. So willing to open up for a workshop for citizenship, or willing to give their employees time off to investigate other services that are available to them.
Oh, thank you, Julia. This has been a robust conversation, lots of good ideas. I suspect our audience, well, I know our audience has some questions because there's already a few in the Q&A box. I'll just remind folks, please do submit your questions. We're going to have one more discussion segment, and then we're going to move to the Q&A portion. But I do want to address policy. I want to bring policy to this discussion because as we're talking about good practices for working with mixed status families, I also want to think about how policy impacts those families. So I'd like to invite Margie McHugh to turn her camera on and join me for a short discussion about policy issues.
I'm on. Can you see me, Karen?
Great. Yes, I see that we've got the slide, and I see you on the side, Margie. So great. Now I see you. So Margie, I just would love your perspective about a couple things. And one of the things that I think we've talked about before is that, these issues related to mixed status families are not new. They've been a challenge for organizations who are working with immigrant communities for decades. And at the same time, we have had hopes for proposals that would enable unauthorized individuals to obtain local status, but they've also been debated for decades. So I'm curious, I'd love your thinking about whether or not there are proposals that you think Congress could advance that would address legalization for some populations. And if so, where do those proposals stand?
Sure. Well, what a day or what a week to be having this conversation, because for those of you who are part of the webinar, this is the the big chance that folks think to advance some of those kinds of measures is through budget reconciliation, because it's clear that there's not going to be sufficient votes to advance typical sort of immigration reform bills, given the margins that are in the House and the Senate right now, in terms of just gathering enough votes for overcoming, in particular, the need for 60 votes in the Senate for a lot of bills to advance. So, as part of budget reconciliation, just on Monday of this week, the House Judiciary Committee passed basically the bill that folks are hoping to get as part of reconciliation. I checked right before we got on the call to see if the Senate parliamentarian has ruled on whether these kinds of measures can be included. There's not been a ruling yet, but if you figure that there are around 10.5 to 11 million unauthorized individuals in the US, about 8 million of them could be covered by the bill that was moved forward by the Judiciary Committee. And the main subpopulations that are included in, there's both what might happen as part of reconciliation, but also there are bills related to each of these various populations. But I've already seen in the chat some questions around DACA youth. Definitely, they're included in these proposals, and it's an even more expanded sort of definition of DACA. Also, folks who have temporary protected status, in some cases for 15 to 20 years. The top populations there are Salvadorans, Venezuelans, Hondurans, Haitians, and also a pretty solid or expansive definition of essential workers. Includes medical and healthcare workers, IT, telecoms, food and agriculture, transport, logistics. There's a lot of different populations in there as well, and then also a lot of family employment based visa type reforms in what was passed. So it's big. I think a lot of folks expect that it might be negotiated down potentially, but really this is the big strategy, and it's all unfolding right now. So if you haven't been following it, I suggest you follow it, because it could be really big.
Wow, well, you are right. Our discussion is very timely, so thanks for sharing that important update. So another policy question that I have for you, and this is really for something that practitioners are grappling with, and that's this connection between immigrant status and access to a lot of the public programs that support two-generation success. Practitioners have to navigate a patchwork of policies in order to help families access these program services. So do you have any advice or resources that you would point to for those that are maybe new to these issues or trying to figure out strategies for helping their agency?
Sure. So, Karen, you mentioned how long ago we met each other in pieces of work in this field. So, 25 years ago is when the big welfare reform law was passed, and it really codified a whole lot of new policies that were intended to restrict federal public benefits based on immigration status. It defined the types of programs, particularly those that were mean tested. That we were creating a new definition of public benefit programs as part of it. We changed these rules that you mentioned, and that a lot of people are talking about in chat related to public charge. So tons of stuff happened under that law. And I think the prime resource that I put in to the chat already is from National Immigration Law Center. I think they're the best place for folks to start to look at the various kind of history that they have there, but also all of us in the field, I would say, always look at their chart of eligibility for public benefits, because it really lists out who's considered qualified for particular programs, who's considered not qualified. And then it is really helpful in talking about the many different kinds of immigration legal status that folks can have. And I would just say for 2Gen work, we come across this all the time in the work at our center and the technical assistance that we provide in states and localities around trying to open up 2Gen services for immigrant families. And the big stumbling block very often is that the model for 2Gen usually assumes that families have access to TANF, or that that they're able and willing to access SNAP, SNAP benefits, food stamps, or that Medicaid or CHIP programming, that their states are have accepted the options around certain kinds of other services that could be provided to families. And there's also lots of questions because under the Child Care Development Fund, that at least their status, eligibility for the program is based on the status of the child. But a lot of times states are using TANF dollars in order to support childcare expansions and the like. So it gets pretty tricky in some of the early childhood services. And I think that's why, first of all, that's why you see a lot of immigrant families pulling back, where they just feel like, I'm pretty sure I'm not eligible for these things. I'm pretty sure I might be detected if I use them. I might have public charge problems if I want to immigrate, sponsor family members for the future to come into the country. Also, there's just problems with a lot of services not having built the workforce that has the linguistic and cultural competence. But really, the top line issue is always these issues about who's eligible for what within the family, and how does that match up against really trying to build services around the family.
Okay, so you've outlined a lot of challenges, Margie, but I want to be able to lift up some things that maybe practitioners can consider. So even though immigration policy is set at the federal level, are there efforts, top line efforts that you would suggest that states and localities consider to support practitioners? Like what can be done at that level to support those practitioners who are working on the ground as they navigate with families that are facing mixed status, that are mixed status families?
So I'm not coordinated enough to do this right now while I'm talking to you. But there's one other thing that I want to load up, and it's a chart that shows first. So the first thing is states have options built into federal law where they couldn't agree on some wanted to let states be eligible to expand certain programs on their own. Certain states have taken advantage of those options. So I'll load that up as soon as we move into the next part of the webinar, just so that folks will have that available. Also, I know that's not really what frontline programs or practitioners often do, but understanding that that your state may or may not have taken advantage of some of these opportunities to extend benefits, I think is an important thing to be looking at. But I found from my years of working on the ground that probably the most helpful thing that states and localities can or did do was to invest in providing formal training on a regular basis, not just training that on these issues, I would say, around immigration status, the connection, who's eligible for what, but not just for community organizations, social workers, folks who are trying to do that frontline work, but also for their own agency workers. Like there is so much time that's taken up by CVO staff trying to inform the folks that are in the government agencies about what the rules are. How many times have you had to email, frontline staff the rules on certain programs and the like? So I just think having a formal way that kind of training is regularly provided, that it's transparent, is critical. And then Julia mentioned some of what's happening in California. It happens in a number of states where they're actually funding kind of legal services capacity and agency capacity just to understand what's going on in immigration policy. It's a big issue right now with the Afghan evacuee population, with trying to figure out they're coming in different statuses, what might they be eligible for, how to hurry up and train frontline staff around that. Also having states have some sort of backup legal services expertise or capacity around these issues really goes a long way to also having even more senior policy people with agencies be able to figure out, what are the things they need to act quickly on? How can they understand what's coming down from the federal government? What do they need to do in order to update and get the message out through all their social service or other systems? So anyway, but there's just so much information and technical information involved in these issues. And I have a lot of sympathy for folks on the government side. These are massive, massive bureaucracies trying to move really quickly. And that the Afghan situation is really a perfect situation. What's been happening at the southern border with folks being paroled in, all of these create a set of issues that frontline staff, whether you're on the community-based organization side or that interface that all of the public benefits agencies have, there's a lag time that really needs to always be shortened.
Right. Margie, this is so helpful. We have just a few minutes left, and rather than throw another question out at you, I'm thinking one of the things we talked about with our speakers is whether or not they wanted to weigh in. So I know they've been listening in. I want to invite our three speakers to turn their cameras on because we're going to move to Q&A in just a second, but I do want to just have a minute if any of the speakers had any ads that they wanted to share about policy and add on to Margie's remarks. If not, we can move to the Q&A. Okay, great. So we do have a couple questions in the chat, in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with those. But again, feel free to add additional questions if you have any. But I'm going to start with a question from Alexander Baum. The question is, given the affordable housing challenges, and this I think is for Napa, you guys lifted those up. What are some of the strategies that you've seen to help undocumented immigrants access more housing options, especially as more landlords are requiring Social Security numbers and background checks, which further limits availability?
I will start, and unfortunately, I don't have a great answer. It's a real issue. We have a vacancy rate that is often near 0% or less than 2%. We see a ton of, and Susanna can provide more context here, a ton of informal living arrangements. So oftentimes, I can say when we construct financial assistance programs, we take into account the fact that a lot of living situations are informal. So rather than just saying, let's see, your lease with your landlord, we might, Susanna's case managers might call up a landlord and have a conversation because that landlord might be the sublessee of somebody else who's documented. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot to add around strategies. The only thing I do have to add is that recently our foundation launched an initiative to help spur accessory dwelling unit development because it is a less expensive and faster way to get what could be considered naturally occurring affordable housing on the market. And it's our hope that down the road, if we can encourage and help more homeowners who can afford it to build an accessory dwelling unit, that we can provide incentives to them to rent at affordable rates and to take chances on tenants who may not be as attractive to other landlords.
Yes, I agree. This has been a real challenge. Also, one of the main indicators for declining enrollment within our districts as well, folks are just leaving. It's too expensive for housing. I will say that this has really spurred us to really think more civically about how do we engage our residents into pushing for innovative housing measures, because at this point, it's true, we're going to have to, push our city officials and advocate for the needs of our communities. And it's very unfortunate, like I mentioned earlier, we have 2-3 families per household, and it's just been really, the overcrowding is also an issue. So, we have a great partnership with the Napa Valley Fair Housing. We're looking at, looking at promotoras and pushing some of these measures and advocating for, the needs. But I agree with Julia, it has been a challenge, and and it has for many other Bay Area cities as well.
Can you just elaborate? There's a question about the accessory dwelling. Is that akin to a tiny house? Just share a little bit about what that is.
It's akin to a granny unit. So oftentimes it's an above garage apartment or a garage conversion, slightly different than a tiny house because it is a livable dwelling unit and it's a permanent dwelling unit. But oftentimes you hear them called granny units or casitas or other more clever names than ADU.
Okay, we have another question. This may be for Margie, maybe for some of our other speakers. There's a question about a resource. Is there a link or a resource that can be shared that's a concise description of the various documents of citizenship and resident alien status? So such as the I-551, the I-94, student visas, et cetera. Is there anywhere that, any resource you all can recommend?
Yes, I think that was a question for Maureen, and I was going to write back to her individually, but the first resource that I put up from National Immigration Law Center, it links to a whole, there's a page, a section of their website that has both the history of some of the issues, but the specific link should be addressing some of those, the very specific statuses that folks might have. So you caught me also looking up whether it's legal for landlords to ask for social security numbers. So I just wanted to say, my recollection is, this might be like a local human rights commission issue, or it might be, I'm not sure how different localities, I would doubt states deal with it, but I would say different localities might deal with it. And because I know in some localities, they have very specific sort of human rights, anti-discrimination issues where, I don't know, it turned out that that some landlords were requiring an upfront special deposit, not deposit, like just money, because the apartment had to be specially cleaned if you were cooking Indian food in it, like just stuff that that once the Human Rights Commission folks got on top of it, it also led to saying that leases had to be translated into the top languages, spoken by folks in the city and the like. So I would just say that it would really surprise me if there weren't some local laws related to landlords not being able to ask for social security numbers. So that could be another thing people put on their agenda, like in terms of bringing to state and local government, well, local governments probably, to have changed if that's a big problem in the area that you're in.
So we have another a comment about working with youth. When we think about two-gen families, we talk about the adults and the kids, but are any of you specifically working with youth and can share a little bit of information about how your programs are supporting youth in two-gen program in a two-gen fashion?
Yeah, so I can. Were you going to share, Vicki?
You start.
So I can share, Karen. Currently, we have our youth program, which is the Youth Leadership Academies. It's a credit-bearing class. It happens during the day for high school kids 9 through 12. And really the main focus is to create a non-traditional class space to work with youth, specifically looking at youth of immigrant families, looking at youth who are maybe first generation, and majority of, I would say, in our group currently are Latinx and low income. So this program in particular is about supporting the student, but at the same time, we're connecting with parents. So I can give you a perfect example. During COVID, a lot of our students had to go to in-person, instead of in-person learning, had to do virtual classes. And for many of the families who have very limited education or who had to work, they would, many times the high schooler kids would be at home trying to juggle, being in a Zoom class and at the same time maybe taking care of siblings. There was a lot of dynamics there. But what we identified that the students that were struggling the most during their virtual classes had a lot going on at home. So how do we provide, comprehensive case management, case management to the parents of those students to be able to better support them with their studies? So, was that helping the mom better understand how to navigate the educational platform so that they can be more involved, connecting them to their students' teachers so that they can have those one-on-one conversations. Another big goal of the program is to help these kids with college and career preparedness, right? Helping them to feel like they're leaders in their community. We do various projects, and really it's how do I, student of color, feel welcome in a community where I can go off to university and come back and feel like I can continue to serve and support my community. So that's some of the things that we cover through our youth leadership program. I'm not sure if there's any other specific questions around that.
And I would just say, I think, one of the things I've seen happen in the last 10 years is a proliferation of more apprenticeship youth summer workforce opportunities that give young people opportunities to learn requisite skills in different jobs and get exposure to different careers. I know in Illinois, in Chicago in particular, we've been really investing in our summer jobs program, regardless of status, so that we can really help young people manage money, learn financial literacy, but also gain some career exposure and possible jobs out there. And I think, in many cases, what we know is that when kids don't have enough to do, that's when they're apt to be idle and get into things that may not be as productive for them. And so, the opportunities around youth development programs, after school programs in general, and where schools actually have older kids come back and help younger kids, I think are always great opportunities to help continue to support young people in their own growth, but also show ways in which they could see themselves in a career trajectory in those opportunities too.
We have a program locally that we've funded for 4 or 5 years that's run by a farm worker foundation. And it is a summer internship program for children of those that are children of farm workers who want to go into the industry, whether or not they intend on attending a 4-year college. They spend all summer, and importantly, it's paid. So 4 or 5 local employers in all areas of the wine industry get together and they pitch in funding to pay a decent hourly wage. And then the philanthropic funding helps to pay for things like soft skills and equipment. And this is particularly important because we have a lot of second generation wine industry families who are really wealthy, whose kids can go to the top colleges and study viticulture. And then you have thousands of children of those working in the fields who may be interested in entering the industry, but need a bit of a boost before they're going straight to a 4-year college.
You have one follow-up question, and then I'm going to try to squeeze in one more before we go to your top advice, but this is a follow-up regarding the youth jobs. It's how do you provide job opportunities for young people without work authorization, especially opportunities that provide sufficient income to cover their financial needs?
I lost the question.
Well, Karen, I can start. I mean, I understand the piece about sufficient income, but currently I can tell you with our high school students, we do something similar with youth intern projects during the summer. They do amazing projects, but these young people receive a stipend. We keep it under the IRS federal limit to where then they don't have to report the stipend necessarily. So that's one way around that. And so in that case, we don't need a W-2, we don't need to get their information for that. In regards to sustainable, wage jobs, I think, it just depends. We have many organizations who take on folks as independent contractors, and you can go down that route. There is also opportunities for co-ops and opportunities for folks to be part of that as well. But those are the main ones that I can think of right now.
So I'd love for you all to weigh in on something that was, oh, go ahead, Margie, did you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to point out one thing here about youth that, that it harkens back to the immigration status questions that that there's, first of all, the DACA population within that. Maybe there'll be some help on that. Most kids with unauthorized parents are U.S. citizens. Those who are arriving as we would say late arriving newcomers is what we would call them, kids who arrive in middle or high school. And I just want to point out that one of the really big issues for them is that if they're coming with gaps in their formal education, they get placed into 9th and 10th grade classes where they, unfortunately, especially the boys or the young men, realize within 2 weeks that they're not going to complete all these college-ready graduation standards, and they wonder why they're, why bother? They want to go and support their family maybe, and they just feel like in this context of all the graduation requirements that they're just not going to make it, so they might as well go out and start working. And so I think that's something for folks to think about in their local sort of ecosystem, because a lot of times, there could be ways to address some of that with a smart adult education program that has no immigration status requirements. And, and those folks, if there's case management, which increasingly there is in a lot of places, they would be able to figure out how many of those kids would be eligible for some formal training programs. So I would just say there's this larger education ecosystem, not just a workforce training ecosystem, that could be used to be helping a lot of these young people. But it's so used to having so many people come to it, and that they're very often older, that there's just not as much of a focus on youth. So I think there's sensitivity about the late arriving youth. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to engage community colleges, adult education systems, and high schools that are seeing these kids come in and leave within 2 weeks and not be appropriately referred or made available of what else is out there, that there might be some opportunities there that might surprise you in your local ecosystem.
So I wanted to squeeze in one more comment. We're running close on time here, but there was a lot of chat there were a lot of dialogue in the chat about the public charge issue and how do you address it. I'm wondering, in like 2 minutes, is there anything anyone wants to share just to be helpful to our participants about people that are scared to receive assistance because of fear that it'll hurt their immigration case in the future?
I mean, just from an organizational perspective, where we are a sanctuary city, but our state has had ICE raids all over it, and that has trickled down even to our city. I think it's really about consistently showing up and building those relationships for them to realize that you are going to help them. Sometimes it's not even the first or second time that you help provide some information. It's usually like the 5th or 6th time before they're fully engaged, and to be ready for that kind of engagement, relentless process, that they need to make sure that there's not going to be some implication that's dire for them and their family in the context of it. So that's my 2 cents.
All right. Well, Vicki, I'm going to, just because of time, I'm going to limit our conversation on that to your comment. I do want to make sure that we have time to hear one more piece of advice from all of our speakers. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers if you could think about your top piece of advice that you'd want to share with practitioners for working with families regardless of legal status. What would you share? And I'm not going to call on who wants to share first? Won't go in any particular order.
I'll kick us off. And this is a bit of a reiteration or emphasizing, but it's been just monumental to us to invest in and use data as a lens or framing for all of our investments. Again, what we learned in our MPI study wasn't a surprise to us or those that were working on the ground, but having that reputable data opened up so many doors for conversations, as well as funding opportunities. gave us entree with donors who may have not been like-minded before we shared the data with them. So by and large, initially there were some concerns, would we alienate some of our more conservative donors? And but with the exception of one or two people, having that study absolutely gave us the ability to access new opportunities and new funding opportunities.
And I think I would say that that sometimes reaching parents or grandparents is through the children, and that two-generation focuses is really being able to help the parents see the dreams for their children are also dreams for themselves, and really help support that conversation with a parent and their child, but also be able to use it to better support the parent around what they would like to do, and what they would like to move forward in their lives, because oftentimes parents put their children first. And I think there's a way in which it could be a better entree point to also help families and parents understand there are opportunities that are out there that they could benefit from too.
Yes, very similarly, I think, individuals don't leave their homeland and everything they know behind without believing the risk is worth it. So coming from experience, my parents as well, that unwavering belief that this country is going to provide, families with access to a better future, despite the challenges they may encounter, is a huge motivator. So leveraging those aspirations, those values, that's going to encourage, that courage. It's really listening to immigrants and families and parents, addressing those systematic barriers that are standing in their way, and again, creating those welcoming environments, and engaging as well as individuals who are reflective of that community, including racial, cultural, and linguistic diversity of the immigrant community. I think as much as we can, giving them that power to make decisions and feel like they are included and being part of that impact as well.
And I might just jump in, Karen, to say that building off of what I was saying earlier about the training, that state and local governments really should be already funding regular training related to immigration status issues and the like. I think just building off of that a little bit, I've been thinking a lot about the big childcare expansion that's probably coming, and also the money with ARP and other funds that's flowing into K-12. And everybody's allegedly responsible for parent engagement, and yet, nobody's doing it in a real way. I shouldn't say nobody, but that there's so little that's being done in a real way for immigrant and refugee families. So I feel like there's an opportunity with all the equity conversations that are happening to connect the data about characteristics of immigrant background children and their families. And you would inevitably arrive at the fact that parent-focused programming should be focused on, digital access and literacy, which is really not even technically rewarded or funded, by the adult education system. It's really not included in what's happening in Title I funds under ESSA. With the childcare expansion, a lot of states are realizing to be equitable, they really need to address family, friend, and neighbor care. Well, if they're going to do that, are they going to be saying you should be collecting immigration? You should be collecting, the forms they'll use will be the same forms potentially that they're doing for mainstream childcare development funds. So I just feel like trying to take the time to figure out how to be part of some of these tables that work in these fields to locally, to be giving feedback so that, the application forms don't come down asking all these things that are unnecessary, or that, we're really thinking about how to bake in equity from the start for a lot of kids in these families. This is really an amazing moment, or an amazing, several months or year coming up in terms of trying to get it right in a way we haven't in a really long time. So I hate to be asking so many busy people who are already trying so hard to work on the front lines, but we have to find ways for their expertise to flow up in systems and meet the care and the concern of people who are trying to reach down and reach other populations.
Well, thank you all. I think that this is kind of the perfect way to wrap up our session, hearing your brilliant thoughts and advice to practitioners. So I want to thank you all and just share a few final concluding remarks. First, I want to thank all the participants as well for attending. We're glad you were here for this second session. Also to lift up, as the slide says, we've got 2 more opportunities that are coming up fairly soon. The peer advising session will be on September 30th. So please register for that. Also submit a peer question. It's a great way to get free advice. And then our next webinar will be on October 14th on growing language skills. So again, those Clifford Devin just dropped the registration link in the chat if you haven't registered already. We are going to be sending an email with a link to all these resources. I did see in the chat there was a question about whether or not they'll get the resources that are listed in the chat. We will have those posted on the Aspen CSG website. And then lastly, I want to let you know that we are going to be sending you a short evaluation just to get your feedback about today's webinar. This is a series, so we really do value your input so we can take your feedback and help us shape and improve our future webinars. So thank you so much for joining us.